Okay, we should be ready.
Great. So good morning, everyone. My name is Leo Wilson, and you are here with us for the Region 7 Stakeholder Advisory Committee meeting on July 26th to 22nd. And I'm going to go ahead and call us to order today. Our first order of business today would be to ask if there are any public comments on the information we've reviewed at our previous meetings or anything on the agenda today. Keep in mind that we're going to try and keep these public comments relatively brief. About 3 minutes would be all we would take, but you're always welcome to go ahead and provide additional input on electronically to region7@aacounty.org or to any of the members of the committee. So with that, is there anyone from the public who would like to say anything before we get underway?
And Leo, I don't see any attendees from the public.
Okay. Great, and I didn't see anything come up in the chat yet either, Patrick. So we're going to go ahead and close that portion of our meeting here. So again, for those who are listening and just not in the room there, that's how it's going to happen moving forward. Just go ahead and feel free to provide comment. So moving into our old business, we have approval of the meeting notes, and Patrick sent those out in our meeting announcement, and Desiree. So everyone should have received those in the reminder for the meeting today. I've had a chance to review them. Has everyone else had a chance to review them? And if so, does anyone want to make a motion to make any modifications to these? No corrections? Okay, so can I ask for a motion to approve the notes as presented?
This is Tony. I'll make a motion that we accept the minutes as presented.
Okay, we'll accept Tony's first. Is there a second?
Second.
There we go. So so we're going to accept the notes as presented. And so we'll close that item as well. Again, I don't know who's typing this fast. Is that you, Desiree? Good Lord.
Occasionally.
That's great. Okay. So another item on our agenda here is a reminder to everyone to check their Gmail accounts. There's just so much information in there for our kind of clearinghouse location for all of our information. And I was able to direct my Gmail account to my regular email service. So it just kind of feeds in. But if you don't have that set up, you can talk to Patrick and Desiree. Maybe they can help you with it. And also, if you don't have it and can't quite get to that, just be sure to check it, because that's where kind of all of our communication is coming in. So so that's a reminder about Gmail. Are there any other open items, old business that we want to talk about now?
I don't have any additional items at this point.
Okay. How about you, Desiree?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay, great. So, so that closes out our old business portion of the agenda. And now we'll talk about today. So today's going to be an exciting meeting. We have a lot of information that's going to come to us, and a couple of presenters who are pretty, will really help provide some background for us as we continue the work that we're trying to do. And I didn't read the role of the charter here. It's on the agenda at the bottom, so I'll spare you me. I'm trying to read through it, but remember, what we're essentially trying to do here is take information in from all of the sources that have been so kind to help provide us with that information. And what we're trying to do is figure out what our recommendations will be to the county about recommending changes in zoning and strategies for a regional vision, that type of thing. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and start our presentations today. And for that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Patrick, if that's all right.
Okay, sure. Thank you. So we have four guests who are going to be presenting on various aspects of housing and housing policy and the housing reality in our region today. And so we're going to start it off with Dan Pontius. Dan is the Housing Policy Coordinator for the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. And Dan, do you want to share your screen, or would you like me to share my screen and show your presentation from there?
Let me see if I can share it here. Oh no, it looks like I can't actually.
Okay,
You'd have to change the permissions, I think.
Okay, well then let me
But you can
see
just
if
pull
I
it
can
up too.
yeah, sorry, give me 1 second to get this right. Bear with me. I'm trying to pull
Although
up the.
I'm seeing your second screen here. I don't know if you have sort of two.
Yeah, I'm trying to. There.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. All right. Well,
All right.
thanks. Should I just launch into it here?
Yes, please do.
Okay. My name is Dan Pawnee. I'm the Housing Policy Coordinator at the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. I'm going to start out with I think we're kind of starting from the 30,000 foot view and kind of gradually getting down to your part of Anne Arundel County. Why don't you just go to the next slide? Just to tell you a little bit about the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. We're the region's kind of council of governments. This here you can see the region that we cover. It's Baltimore City and the 6 surrounding counties. Our board is primarily the executives of all those jurisdictions. We do a number of things. Primarily, we do regional transportation planning. That's required in order to receive federal transportation funds. As part of that, we also do air quality planning. We also do cooperative purchasing. We help local governments save money on electricity and school supplies and things like that by all negotiating prices as a region rather than each jurisdiction kind of being on their own for that. And then I'm the housing policy coordinator. I staff a housing committee of sort of local jurisdictions and private sector stakeholders that meets each month to talk about key housing issues around the region. We did a lot of information sharing around the pandemic and rental assistance, since every jurisdiction kind of had to start a rental assistance program, eviction prevention program from scratch. And then I also help the local governments carry out their duties under the Federal Fair Housing Act in 1968 as well. And some of this that I'm presenting kind of grows out of that. So if you want to go to the next slide, Patrick. I'll just kind of talk to you about sort of the regional housing market context and some nationally too. I mean, these are things I'm sure you folks have seen in the news. One of the pandemic surprises was how much demand there was for new homes, how many people were buying homes in the middle of a pandemic. And the Baltimore region was no exception to that national trend. You can see that the green line on this graph is 2020, and the blue line is 2021. So you can see prices went up year over year. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see it's not just a pandemic phenomenon either, though. So here's a 2017 headline from the Capital Gazette about kind of an inventory squeeze in Anne Arundel County way back then. And then the bottom graph is from Bright MLS here in the region, which goes back to 2017 and shows that ever since then we've had really year over year increases each month, pretty much. 5%, 10%, even 15% year over year, and so you have a few years of that, and your prices are much higher than they were 6 years ago. So if you go to the next slide. And so that, those price increases are great if you already own a home in terms of providing equity that you can use for your next home or for other things. But it's not so great for people who don't yet own a home. And there are a number of articles about how these rising prices and now the rising interest rates from the Fed are making it much harder for new homeowners to get into the game here. And this is a map from a spring Washington Post article that shows how much rents have been rising over the last 2 years. Here in the Baltimore region, you can see Anne Arundel County is around 15%, just over 15% increase in 2 years in rent. So you can see that housing prices just in general are going up. This is part of the inflation that we're all experiencing. One of the things that's going up more rapidly is our housing prices. So if you go to the next slide, this is where it ties into our Fair Housing Act work. There's been a decent amount of national attention to the fact that these racial homeownership gaps have been pretty stubborn since literally the passage of the Fair Housing Act more than 50 years ago. So if it's hard for new homeowners to get into the act, then that means that these dynamics are going to make it really hard to make progress on these homeownership gaps, which are kind of a legacy of 20th century federal housing policy that really favored white homeownership. And if you go to the next slide, Patrick. And then these are graphs that this is from a fair housing analysis we did in 2020 that shows that each jurisdiction here in the Baltimore region, including Anne Arundel County, also have these pretty wide racial homeownership gaps. And so this was sort of a new thing that not a new thing, obviously, but it sort of newly stood out to us during this analysis. And so we've been working to see what we can do in the region to tackle these gaps. We've done focus groups with housing counselors around the region who are working with generally moderate income people trying to get into home ownership. And one of the themes that we've heard around the region is the difficulty in inventory, that there just aren't homes around that people can afford to buy.
Dan, can I ask a question about this graph?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I don't know what the percentages mean. Does that mean a percentage of the homes owned, a percentage of that ethnicity? What does that mean?
Yeah, so if you take the Anne Arundel section, the gray bar means that 80% of non-Hispanic white people in Anne Arundel County are homeowners, whereas only 51% of Black residents of Anne Arundel County are homeowners.
And do you happen to have gross numbers for all of these or no?
We do, yeah. In fact, we probably have more up-to-date numbers that I could share if you're interested in those. It's a remarkable, like if we're going to equalize the Black-white homeownership gap, 44% of Black renters would need to become homeowners. It's when you look at the numbers rather than the percentages, it's even more daunting in some ways.
And then one more question, and maybe you're going to cover it in a future slide, but just do you have anything that talks about the price of the houses, the value of the houses that are owned by different ethnic groups?
We don't have that. I mean,
Like,
there's
people own $1,000 houses or $1 million houses.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine, folks have probably seen the racial wealth gap numbers, which are pretty stark. So that probably, I cut down this presentation. There's the foreclosure crisis really hit Black homeowners much harder than other homeowners. So anyway, yeah, so I don't know the numbers on that, but.
And this includes condominiums, townhouses, single family homes, anything that's a homeowner. Okay.
Right, exactly. It's just owning versus renting.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm, sure.
And this is Tony. I don't want to break. I know you want to finish your presentation, but being a resident here for as many years as I have, I'm from Glen Burnie originally, lived here since I was in the military. And what I'm seeing is that those Black homeowners, many of them are the older Black homeowners, and that's something to consider. As the prices have gone up and things have changed, you'll see less and less as you're showing right now. So that's going to be a trend because of the affordability or lack thereof of houses.
Right. Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of information about how it's harder for younger people in general. There's a real difficulty of younger people becoming homeowners, and yeah, it's just going to exacerbate these disparities. So, but why don't we go to the next slide? I just have a couple more, I think, here. And so anyway, these are just some headlines from recent coverage of, there's a pretty wide consensus around the country right now that we just are not building enough housing to accommodate our population growth. That one of the, I mean, we kind of have been here before. If you think back to 2005, 2006, when there was a huge increase in housing prices, people thought housing prices would never go down again. And then they did, we had the big crash, but that was a point where there was easy mortgage money. It was remarkably easy to get a mortgage, and banks were doling out subprime mortgages with really high interest rates and giving them to anybody. And then these banks and investors were bundling them and buying them like crazy. And then we're really left holding the bag when people could not pay their mortgages. But really, the analysts are seeing that that's not the case now. We don't, banks remember the foreclosure crisis, and they're not, it's not that easy to get a mortgage now. So people are saying it's really not a bubble. It's just the fact that we're not meeting the demand with new supply of homes. And in fact, you see the Freddie Mac icon snip there. They did this study before the pandemic in February 2020 on the housing supply shortage in the states. So if you could go to the next slide. And there's been some attention even before the pandemic. WashCog, our counterpart in the Washington region, Washington Council of Governments, was looking at this and feeling like, wow, in the Washington region, we need more housing. And Montgomery County has done very interesting work on this and really looked at their permitting of houses, of residential units, and how that's really declined over time. And they've made some policy changes to try to account for that. And one of the things that BMC does is we track housing residential permits around the region. And so I went back, dug through all the old books on our shelves back to 1965. This is really hard to see here, but the leftmost bar is 1965 and the rightmost bar is 2020. The orange taller bars are the whole metropolitan area, and the shorter blue bars are Anne Arundel County. And you can see that from 1965 to about 2000, we're missing 3 years in here. I can't find the books for those. But we were permitting, almost 15,000 units a year. And then that dropped. The average from 2001 to 2020 is more like 8,000 units. It's a drop of 45, 46% between those time periods. And if you go to the next slide, I think this is my last slide, just to kind of go through some of these numbers. So like I said, there's a 46% reduction in residential permits. So we're just building a lot less housing than we used to. And that's true in Anne Arundel County too. Went down from about 3,500 permits a year to just over 2,000, almost a 40% reduction in those same two time periods. If you and looking at the Freddie Mac, we're still looking, a number of different folks are trying to get a handle on this from the data. Freddie Mac estimates that Maryland as a whole has a 3.26% housing shortage. And if we prorate that for the Baltimore region, just to give us a sense of what might be the shortfall, that would say we're really like 39,000 homes short of really producing the homes that are needed to support the workers here.
When you're talking about homes, are you talking about rental or ownership?
This is everything, actually. In fact, if
Okay.
that bar chart is both single family and multifamily. It's both types of construction, and it's permits, units permitted. So it's really everything.
So it's single family, multifamily, rental, and ownership.
Right.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, this is John Holiday. Any sense on the number of obsolete housing? So we think about new housing from new permits coming to the market. What about housing that during the last year over this time period that's actually become obsolete just due to age, lead, environmental concerns, or just frankly age and falling apart?
Yeah, we don't have. I mean, there are numbers on vacant homes. Homes that are no longer even occupied. But we don't. I don't know that we have data on. And I did ask about, we do have data on rehab permits too, but that's harder to get a handle. I mean, there are people who fix up their homes too.
I mean, my sense would be when something becomes fully obsolete, that maintenance is too expensive, then it gets sold, the new buyer renovates, makes it quite nice, but that drives all pricing higher. Because it obviously the renovation costs are quite expensive.
Yeah, that's not, I mean, like you said, this is only new housing permitted.
Okay.
That include those rehab permits. But that's just kind of I mean, that's just a broad overview just to give you kind of the national and regional context for when you kind of talk about this particular region in Anne Arundel County. All right,
Excuse
there's my
me,
contact information.
can I ask one question before we proceed? When you identify a permit, is a permit per housing unit, or could that be multiple housing units? So that's my question.
Yeah, the data that I'm sharing is number of units. So even if it was one permit for an 80 unit apartment building, it shows in this graph as 80 residents.
Okay, that's all I need. Thank you so much.
Oh, I had one more question on kind of going to what Tony was talking about earlier. And that was, do we have breakdowns of younger homeowners and renters versus and the kind of the baby boomers that are going into retirement and looking for smaller homes to either rent or buy?
Yeah, I don't have that data. I don't have data by age.
And I guess you can only give so much information based on what the surrounding areas say, but this is kind of broad in comparison to how people actually have to live. For instance, the house I live in, I've been here since 94. And before 2008, it was worth almost 800,000. At the end of 2008, it was just meeting the high 300,000. And we've just started getting back on top of it again. If I sold my house today, I couldn't buy it back. I live in Annapolis. If I sold my house today, I couldn't buy it back. So the reality is our county, the state is really pricing out people who have been here. There may be renters who may never be homeowners unless the life changes drastically. So the reality of where we're going to be in 2040 is not a clear picture or actual picture of what is really at our feet. That makes sense?
Tony, this is Leo. It does make sense. I think, Lance did a nice job of giving us an overview of the region, and I think we're going to hear from some other presenters today, but, it's clearly apparent to anyone who works in this industry that, these changing trends are, extremely problematic for trying to keep a diverse community here. It's just really hard for everyone to keep up, given, how these trends are going, and the reduced inventory of available places to live is a huge problem. And we'll hear more about that today. Dan, thanks for the presentation. And again, we'll be sure to get back to you with our questions as we move through this process. I'm going to keep us moving and get to our next presenter, if that's okay.
And I can stick around if there are questions later too.
Oh, great. Thanks so much. That's awesome. So our next presenter is from Elm Street Communities, and that's I think that's the right order here, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
Great. And so that's going to be, is it Karen McJunkin?
That's correct.
Great. Well, thanks for coming to talk to us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Patrick, I think you're going to have to
Share my screen. Okay,
Yeah.
give me 1 second to
Sure.
get set up here.
Well, first, thanks to you all for having me speak today. I am a regional partner with Elm Street Communities, and I've been developing residential and mixed-use communities in Anne Arundel County and various parts of Maryland for the last 33 years, plus or minus. My focus today will be on discussing the Anne Arundel County for sale new housing market. That's Aaron's presentation.
Oh, it
Patrick.
sure is. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm going to talk about the Anne Arundel County for sale new construction housing market, both from a supply perspective and a demand perspective. And then at the end, I'll just throw out a few ideas that other jurisdictions in this region are using to try and tackle the same issues that Anne Arundel County is facing right now. I'll wait for Patrick to pull it up.
I'm sorry, give me 1
Hey,
second.
no worries.
Okay.
There we go.
All right, that should be
All
it.
right, perfect. So Dan started us off with statistics that really shine a light on the housing shortage. I'm going to get a little more granular in my presentation this morning and talk about what is getting built in this market and why. If you want to move to the next screen, and I'll start with housing supply. Next slide, Patrick, if you could. There we go. Starting with supply characteristics and trends, our market in Anne Arundel County, and for the region for that matter, is dominated primarily by large production builders. That has only increased in the last couple of decades. Large production builders are just better able to compete in a supply constrained market. They're low cost producers. They have economies of scale. And the smaller builders just have a difficult time because they're often undercapitalized competing in this market. That's not to say there aren't, but there are many fewer smaller builders in this market. So the end result is we have fairly standard product across this market and the region that tends to look similar and tends to not just look similar, but have similar layouts and functionality. So this is just a cross section of what we typically see in Anne Arundel. The lower left, single family detached, going left to right. In the middle of the screen is an age restricted villa product that's typically built. And then the townhouses on the right of the screen that we're used to seeing. We want to move to the next slide. Some other supply characteristics. We've seen a trend in the last decade or so where fewer single family detached are getting built from a proportionality perspective, and more townhomes are getting built in the county. Very few condominiums are getting built for primarily risk reasons, both financial and legal risks that condominiums present. And that's unfortunate because oftentimes condominiums are the most affordable product. As I mentioned before, little variation in product type over the last 20 years. It is simply very efficient to build what is being built today, both from a cost perspective and an approval perspective. What you're seeing getting built is a path of least resistance, giving current subdivision regulations and zoning ordinances. And then moving to the next slide, we're seeing some changes in design on the edges. You know, the top, sorry for the fuzzy picture on the top left, but the top pictures are what's been built for the last 20 years in terms of townhouses. The bottom two, you know, we're seeing a little bit of differentiation in terms of finishes on the outside, a little more modern looking. As it turns out that my age group is not the dominant buyer anymore. And the younger folks that are able to get into the market want a little more contemporary look. So we're seeing changes like that. But what we're not seeing is what you'll see on the next slide. And that's different product type. This slide represents what is commonly referred to and that many of us know as the missing middle. Upper left is a cottage type house fronting on a green. Bottom left is a sixplex. Lower right is a duplex that have been built on formerly a single family detached lot, and then more examples in the upper right. We're not seeing this product being built in this area, again, primarily because of subdivision regulations. That to build anything like in the upper left, for example, you would need modifications to subdivision regulations and or zoning variances to get that built. That's a risky, time-consuming, expensive process that most folks well, just aren't willing to go through when there are other ways to get through the community approval process. Move to the next slide. A few other trends we're seeing on the supply side. As we've all heard, construction costs have gone up by unprecedented percentages over the last 2 years. We're seeing here in Anne Arundel County and specific projects, 30 to 40% increase in construction costs. That obviously impacts affordability. The average new home price up 15 to 20% over the last 2 years. That's pretty much across the board from starter home all the way up to second and third move up. The other trend we're seeing here in the county in particular, and also it's pretty much mirrored across Maryland, is that just the number of new home communities is down. The number of offerings are down. In this county, it's about 40% the number of new home communities. Now that's offset somewhat by the fact that we have larger communities that are being marketed right now, as opposed to a large number of smaller communities. But all in all, we just have fewer communities and homes that are available for purchase. So that's about it on the supply side. I did want to, before I move off of that, if you go to the next slide, just give you guys some data points on costs. And so this slide shows an actual unit. It's a starter home. It's a 16 by 40 townhome, an actual townhome that's being offered in one of the communities in Anne Arundel County, 1,800 square foot. The first column looks at the cost structure and price as of June of 2022, compares it to the same costs in second quarter of 2019. Moving over to the third column, just a % change in each cost component. And then the last two columns are looking at each cost component and their percentage as a component of the total, both for this particular unit in 2022, and then compares that to the national average, which is the last column. So a couple of takeaways here, other than the unbelievable increase in costs in the third column, % change. If you look at lot costs as a % of total, in our area, in our region, in Anne Arundel County, that typically runs between 25 and 35%, compared to a national average of 17%. Land and lot development costs are expensive in this area, several reasons for that. Some of it is the difficulty in approval process, the lack of zoned ground, and other regulations that add to the costs. The other item probably worth noting is just where we are in terms of fee structure. Permanent impact connection fees in Anne Arundel County are pretty much in line with the region, but compared to the nation, we're a little less than double that percentage. You guys will get a copy of this. I won't go through every number here, but I just wanted to give you this data point. I'll stress it is one product in one community, so it's not representative of everything in the county, but I think it's helpful as to know what the cost components are and how they've trended as you guys look at growth policies in your area. Next slide, please. So moving from supply, we'll go to housing demand characteristics and trends. What have we seen in the last few years? We've seen household size decreasing, and I think that's sort of reflective across the country as a whole. We're seeing many single women buying now that we 20 years ago didn't see. That's a big change. We're seeing fewer children. In fact, in our largest communities, we're seeing about 50% fewer children than the Board of Education predicts every new house will generate. And that has implications on obviously student enrollment. You know, on the good news side, I'm sort of being a downer here, but on the good news side, you know, up until, you know, mortgage rates increased in June, in our communities, we're seeing a lot of ethnic diversity across all of our communities, and happy to see that. There is a large component of age-restricted communities in the county because of the school situation. That particular age group, and maybe I'm biased because I fit into this now, but younger, more active, desiring more amenities. I just bring that up because it is a relatively large component of the market these days. Moving to what folks are looking for in terms of housing and community preference, it's probably no surprise that especially among the younger cohort, they're looking for communities that are close to where they work, shop, eat. They want walkability. They want to not get in their car to go everywhere. And it's sometimes difficult to deliver that with current zoning in the county. I think one of the you know, the results of the pandemic and COVID, folks got back outdoors again, and folks are looking for that outdoor amenity focused community, whether it's community gardens, whether it's you know, a fire pit, a community fire pit with seating around it, walking trails, a lot of focus on that. And again, the younger cohort and older cohort for that matter, more and more folks are looking for low maintenance. As I mentioned last night, it seems like my age group did not do a good job teaching their kids how to mow lawns. And so most of the folks, younger folks, are looking for that townhouse where the HOA takes care of everything. There is a high interest in different product types. If we are able to offer something a little different, if we can find a builder to take that risk, those different product types get snapped up. And that just goes to the whole idea of missing middle and the demand for that. Now, all that being said, everything I've just mentioned, there is still strong demand for single family detached, just not as strong as it once was. You know, as families get older, we're still seeing a strong demand for you know, that single family detached with a yard. In fact, we've seen price increases in single family detached that have far exceeded the townhome price increases recently, and that just has to do with lack of supply. In our area, you know, what drives demand? It's employment, bottom line. And we've got the biggest employer in the state of Maryland in Anne Arundel County, and the biggest job generator, and that's Fort Meade NSA. That's not going away. You know, that as best as we can tell, they're adding at least 2,000 employees, probably more on an annual basis. And so are those folks going to be housed in Anne Arundel County, or are, like it is now, 60% of those folks that work at the Fort live elsewhere and commute into the county every day? And you know, what we're and the second demand driver obviously is pricing and mortgage rates. And in the last 2 months, we have seen with mortgage rates go up, the demand pool has shrunk considerably. The first time home buyer, unfortunately, you know, is pretty much out of the market right now. You know, and we'll go to the next slide to sort of talk about why that is. This looks at that same 1,800 square foot townhouse that we looked at the cost components previously. Looks at what the price was in 2019, what it is today, and then overlays mortgage rates on top of that, 2019 mortgage rates, as well as mortgage rates today. And as you work your way down this slide to the middle, it looks at what the total payment would be back in 2019 versus today. And you're looking about a $1,000 a month increase in cost for that same house. And so what that's done is that same house that was affordable to somebody making 82% of the household median income back in 2019, to afford that same house today, they would need to be making 116%. And that really reduces the number of folks in the county that can afford a new home. And it just builds on what Dan had talked about previously. I think that's, let's go to the next slide, and I'll end my presentation with what I think is the key question. And then again, throw out some ideas that other jurisdictions have used to tackle these problems. And that is, the question, is it possible to increase the housing supply in a way that's environmentally sensitive, which is important to all of us, and compatible with existing neighborhoods, which is incredibly important for your all's region because it's fairly well built out and provides what buyers are looking for. And I don't have the answer to that, but some ideas that other folks have used on the next slide. And you guys have already, in your area, taken care of one of them. And that is, designate higher density town centers in each of these regions to absorb the majority of new building. Annapolis Town Center and the area around that, Parole Town Center, is absorbing an inordinate amount of high density development. And it's building out to what it was intended to do. And, would the same designation, albeit maybe smaller in other regions, help? Probably. And for that to occur, the zoning and subdivision regulations for these areas would need to do what the Parole Town Center Master Plan did, and that is focus more on, and I know they're changing it now to do this even more, focus on three-dimensional design aesthetics and how components interact versus just, two-dimensional regulations that are on the books right now. In order to hit that missing middle, like I said before, we would need an update to zoning and subdivision regulations, no question. I would caution, though, that missing middle, while it certainly would be a key component to addressing the housing supply shortage, it's not a panacea. Remember, it is, all of this would go where housing already exists. And so you have the compatibility issue. Who's going to finally say, yeah, I want that right next to me? And then secondarily, this missing middle on an infill basis, you wouldn't necessarily look to a production builder to build. That's just not within their wheelhouse. So you need a smaller builder, and there might be incentives that would be needed to get those folks building in an affordable manner. And finally, just a couple other things that other jurisdictions have done that might be a little off the wall, but I'll toss them out anyhow. Some jurisdictions have said, okay, so in commercial industrial areas, there aren't existing neighborhoods we have to deal with to worry about compatibility. Let's just allow residential by right and let the market take care of the rest. Fairfax County and Loudoun County, the last point, we're tired of the airport authority at Dulles Airport having an ever expanding airport noise zone and taking hundreds of acres off the table for potential residential development. And they said, okay, you can designate it all you want, but we're not adhering to it, and we're going to build housing there. I'm not advocating for any of these. I'm just tossing some ideas out. And with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you all.
Question to both presenters. This is Tony Spencer. Has anyone considered, I kind of see hints of it in your presentations about the saturation rate. I guess it's kind of hard to determine what that would be by 2040.
Saturation rate in terms of
how many houses you can build and what type. You may be able to get more townhouses in the area than single family homes. You have areas that, because the land has, if you have to do a perk test and it fails, exactly where and how are they planning to create more housing? I know we're just talking right now about Region 7, but Region 7 is very compact as it is. I'm just wondering, in the thinking of our planning, do we have any anticipation of when the saturation will take place? Because it's going to happen.
I think that might be a better question later on for the Anne Arundel Planning Department. I mean, because it's really a lot of it depends on zoning and
Right.
I mean, the kinds of things that Karen was just talking about. You know, there was a sense that, you know, like Howard County has been talking about build out for, you know, we're going to get to build out and we won't be, you know, but they're still building, you know, they're just you're building more multifamily housing, you know.
And I
so-
think in your region in particular, it's probably more of a redevelopment
Mhm.
scenario, the Annapolis Mall.
If it's possible, this is Steve Kaisigler. I'll try and incorporate some of this in my presentation, which is the last one.
Well, Steve, I'm glad you're on here because I won't remember to ask the question again. So you better go ahead and do that. Thank you.
Leo, I had a question, but should we hold questions till the last presentation?
Well, if it's on your mind now, why don't we go ahead and put it out there?
Okay, I just want to make sure we're not running behind schedule. Yeah, Karen, it's interesting. So I live in a townhome. I only have one child, only planning on having one child. So it's interesting because it sounds like I'm very much
You're
part
our
of the
customer.
trend.
Yeah.
But I live in Riva, and even though my development is newer, we're surrounded by some older developments, a lot of split foyer homes, a lot of larger lots. And I've heard about this trend. I think it's called accessory dwelling units, where you can build apartments or convert homes into you know, multiple family homes. Is Anne Arundel County, is the zoning currently supporting that? Is that allowed, or it's not currently allowed right now?
It's not currently allowed, and Steve, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I
Yeah.
haven't found a way to do it, but it's sort of when you talk about missing middle and infill using missing middle, it's exactly that. It's the older stock that was built on a larger lot that could potentially house, you know, 2 or 3 units.
Yeah, because I mean, to Tony's point, yeah, that Riva is completely developed almost, but these lots are pretty large. That doesn't mean, you know, they couldn't be expanded. I know that, you know, you mentioned several issues with doing that, including the fact that a lot of large developers it's not profitable for them. But as we think about talking about zoning and things for the future, that might be something worth considering to me.
It's a great point. We are actually, and this afternoon I have a meeting with a council member on this exact subject about potential future legislation.
Oh, very good. Great.
Let me make a follow-up question. I know Lisa Rodvian tried to introduce that in this past session, and the city of Annapolis already passed an ordinance to allow it. So what happened to Lisa's legislation? I never heard an end result, or is that still hanging out there?
I think it's still hanging out there, and I think she's interested in reactivating the discussion.
Okay.
If I may comment, Anna, currently, I'm Sterling Say. I'm the administrator for the zoning division for Anne Arundel County. Currently, if you have a 14,000 square foot lot, you're entitled to have an accessory dwelling unit, but it must be an owner occupied house. It's limited in square footage. So we do have it now currently, but it's very limited.
Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah, I've heard rumblings about it in the past few years with the affordable housing shortage, and I was just kind of curious to know where Anne Arundel County stands. So, Leo, thanks for giving me a few minutes to ask that question.
If I might also maybe just take a second to ask Karen a question. So I'm Larry Burrows. I actually sit on the board of one of those large home public builders, production builders, Tri Point Homes, and so we actually operate in the area in the county as well as nationally. And the biggest challenge, frankly, for us is finding land that will allow us to be able to build affordable product and kind of take it through the entitlement process. And so maybe Karen, could you just really talk about that a little bit in terms of, and maybe you had some suggestions about what could be done as from a zoning point of view, an administrative point of view that might encourage that. We actually build missing middle product, not so much in this metropolitan area because of what Karen talked about, the brain damage and the risk that it takes to have to go through changing regulations, but where zoning allows that product gets built, and new product gets built pretty frequently, but it's much tougher here. Anyway, the point is that if there's some suggestions that you might have that might help us as we're thinking about making recommendations in terms of zoning and land use.
Well, I think, as you alluded to, it's a difficult, highly regulated process, and not passing judgment on whether or not the regulations make sense or not. But I think it might be helpful if we were able to sort of break down what the regulations cost. And then you can make value judgments on whether or not that cost is worth it. Stormwater, they're layer after layer of regulations. I read a study by National Association of Home Builders this morning, as a matter of fact, that regulations, whether it's building code or environmental regulations or other setbacks, everything else that reduces density, adds $90,000. That's a national average to the cost of a single family detached home. And I was having a conversation with somebody earlier this morning that it would be really interesting to drill down on this county or this region and figure out what those costs really are. And then once you have that, you can determine, okay, if we want to build more affordable housing, and we want to target 80% of household median income, can we delayer some of that costly regulation for those particular product types? Those are some ideas.
Yeah, and then I'm assuming also as part of that, and again, this is where you get into the issues with zoning, allowing greater density, which then.
Sure, that's always, and that's really what every regional group is confronted with right now, right? Everybody sees the shortage, but who's going to grapple with, and what makes the most sense? Where does it make the most sense to increase density? And that's why, the whole idea of this town center, and why your all's area has absorbed a lot of the density, a lot of the growth, and there are more multifamily projects coming on the Riva corridor. Should more regions have that town center where you load it up on density and it's walkable and you've got retail and everything else? Is that a possible solution?
And just one last comment before you move on. My background is fire service. My last 10 years, I was in the fire marshal's office and a nationally certified fire inspector. Many times we were bumped heads with the fire marshal's office, the building department, planning and zoning. Planning and zoning may allow something where the fire marshal's office or building would not. So are we going to have a collaboration? This is more to Stephen. Are we going to have a collaboration with the fire, understanding how that fits into all of this? When you talk about density, that's where the trade-offs.
Well, what I would say to that is the way the development review process works, OPZ, my office, is kind of the coordinator of up to 17 different agencies who review projects. One of them is the fire marshal's office. Fire marshal's office has enormous power, makes recommendations that we tend to treat as gospel and law. So I don't see a disconnect between the fire marshal's office and OPZ. What I see is there may be a disconnect in what the fire marshal wants to do versus what the client wants to do.
Right.
But you guys rule in your regs, and I don't overrule you. I don't have that legal authority to do. I don't grant modifications against public health, safety, welfare, regulations. So I'm not sure, that may be a future discussion, but I'm not seeing a disconnect between us. I do see that the client gets very frustrated with some of the fire marshal's comments and your application of the code, but not from us. We have a healthy respect for what you do. I mean, you're the public health, safety, welfare component.
And that came about as a result of major multiple tragedies over the years.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Yes. Thanks a lot.
Yep.
So, Karen, thanks so much for the presentation. I'm going to make 3 brief comments and we're going to move on. I know we're a little bit behind, but I'll go ahead anyway. So you mentioned in your presentation, redesignating certain industrial commercial uses to residential. Well, you see that happening in the redevelopment work in East Baltimore, where you see Canton and Fells Point, where people have really embraced the aesthetic of the industrial buildings that were there and repurposed those. And so I think that's a real nice opportunity because there seems to be less demand for those structures in their original use. And so redevelopment of projects that had a prior life is a real opportunity. And we should be looking at that here in Anne Arundel County, particularly in our region. And then the second was, I know that Green Street doesn't do a lot of, it didn't look like you guys do a lot of mixed use, but the mixed use really speaks to the the market demand for walkability. So when we look at the projects that are being considered here in a more urban environment, these first floor retail and commercial uses seem to tie nicely with a way to provide additional income for those properties and to meet that demand for walkability. And then the third problem that we have here, the third point is that, there's in some communities, there's really strong opposition to increased density. And we see that here quite a bit, particularly in Annapolis, where what's happened is Anne Arundel County is starting to do these higher density things. And we're not seeing as much of it in the city center. And it's unfortunate because I think there's opportunities, but I think those are how you could solve the problems in this area. So things to consider as we move forward. So we're going to go ahead and move on. And I know we're a bit behind, so we're going to push past our break. And our next speaker is going to be from Arundel Community Development Services, and that's Erin Karpowitz, if I've said that right. Thanks for coming.
Yes. Hi, Leo. Thanks for the welcome, and thanks everybody for volunteering your time to work on this important planning process. I'm Erin Karpowitz, and Patrick, if you can share my presentation, I'd appreciate it. I'm the CEO of Arundel Community Development Services. For those of you who might not be familiar with ACDS, we are the county's nonprofit housing and community development. And you can go to the next slide, Patrick. We're the nonprofit housing and community development agency. We contract with the county to carry out a variety of their housing and community development programming and initiatives and award funds to subrecipients. I'm not going to go in through everything that we do right here because I'll get into some of these things later on. But in addition to some of the affordable housing programs that we run or facilitate or fund, we've done the Eviction Prevention program. Dan mentioned a number of partners in the region have done that. Anne Arundel stood up our first eviction prevention program in the state in response to COVID-19, and that's been super successful. Beth Brush from my team is our planning director, and she's really overseen the success of that program. We also do a lot of community grant making. We manage the county's video lottery terminal funds from the casino. And so I get to work with Karen McJunkin in that capacity in the local development council, as well as the county executives, community support grants, some other county funded awards, as well as some of our federally funded awards. These awards range from, helping nonprofit organizations combat food insecurity in our communities to providing after school programming for some of our low and moderate income communities to helping seniors get repairs or transportation so they can stay in their homes. So a wide range. We're probably one of the biggest grant makers in Anne Arundel County. I think this year for FY23, we're slated to make over 150 grant awards. I think some of that will go down as some of our COVID funding goes down, but we still want to be in the mix, supporting our community organizations and building their capacity. And then, of course, creating and preserving affordable housing opportunities. And that's what I'm going to talk about. Our organization, especially because of the federal entitlement funding that we receive, we're very focused on helping our underserved communities and our low and moderate income communities. So that's kind of the lens that I'm looking at this from. You heard from Karen, you heard from Dan, who kind of gave a big picture regional approach. Karen really drilled down and talked about home ownership and how that might be accessible to people in the middle income area. And we're really looking at people who are more at the moderate and low income area or low income categories. So people who are making under 120% of area median income. Next slide, please. Thank you, Patrick. So again, the county and Office of Planning and Zoning with the general development plan, one of the goals and the objectives is to create a range of affordable housing opportunities for people in a range of incomes, not just low and moderate income, but middle income as well as having an array of different housing types to meet the demand of residents in Anne Arundel County. So it can be affordable at different income ranges. I've been asked to kind of talk about what is affordable housing. Typically, a housing unit is considered affordable if a household is not paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs. So if you're a renter, that would typically be your rent and your utilities. And if you're a homeowner, it would typically be your mortgage, your principal, interest, taxes, insurance, as well as your utilities. And so if we're talking, if you saw the example that Karen provided, the typical townhome, which, now today costs $450,000, you're probably going to need an income at about 120% of the area median income to be able to afford that townhouse. So market rate, that would be typically someone buying market rate housing. That's someone who's buying a unit that doesn't have any subsidy. And so there's a need to create policies and planning decisions that allow for that market rate housing to happen in some measured way and an environmentally sensitive way, so that we can meet that middle income. But then we also need housing that's affordable to low and moderate income households. And typically that requires, in addition to land use regulations, it includes some kind of funding subsidy. And my organization provides some of that subsidy, and depending on the source of the funding subsidy, that kind of dictates what the income limits are for that project. Typically, affordable housing and workforce housing programs that are providing a subsidy, they do have income restrictions that range anywhere from, a household, maybe one project has income limits that mean a household earning 50% of area median income and below, all the way up to 120% of area median income and below. Most of our federal programs are at, they're focused on people earning 60% of area median income. Some of our county and state programs allow us to go up a little bit higher, above 100% of area median income. So for example, federal low-income housing tax credits that are provided through the state, and then we also bring in some gap financing. Those have to serve people that are earning 60% and below of AMI. So for a family of three, that's about $62,000 a year for our region. Our mortgage assistance program, it serves first-time home buyers. That typically is serving people who are making 80% of AMI. Our workforce housing zoning provision in this county, it sets limits for of 60% AMI for the rental units and 100% of AMI for the home ownership units. So this is just all to say there's not like a nice and neat, easy definition of affordable housing. When we're talking about subsidized housing, it really depends on the program. But again, there's a need and a desire to have affordable housing units available to people of all income ranges. So it really just depends on what you're talking about when you're using that terminology and what that terminology means. Next slide, please. So just real quickly, some affordable rental needs in the county, especially for our low and moderate income residents. According to the latest HUD data, we had 22,505 renters in Anne Arundel County. Unfortunately, this county specific data there's a lag. So this is probably from 2019 data that HUD uses. And so we had 22,000 renters that were cost burdened. That's out of a total of 52,000 renter households. So about 42% of all renters in Anne Arundel County were paying more than 30% of their income for rent. And if you look at even lower income households, the issue is even more acute and they're even more cost burdened. So of the renter households that were earning 50% of area median income, that's about, again, 52,000 for a family of three. We had about 11,000 that were paying more than 30% of their incomes on that housing. So 80% of renters in that income category were cost burdened. And then just to kind of underscore the need for rental housing programs even more, there are over, and oh shoot, this didn't get updated, but as of March, there were over 28,000 households on the waiting list for the Housing Commission of Anne Arundel County and their programming. And actually, I just checked in with the director yesterday, and he said that unfortunately that waiting list number is up, excuse me, to over 31,000 today, as in July 2022. Next slide, please. So in 2019, this is the latest Anne Arundel County specific study that we completed. We had a consultant actually survey most of the apartment communities in the county, and their analysis showed that we have about 8,900 families or households that are underserved and don't have the right priced housing units if they're making $50,000 and below. At the time, that was households that were making about 50% of area median income. Actually today's data would say that they were making 58,000. So, you know, just based on market trends and the median rent prices going up and the lower vacancy rates, we know that that problem is even more acute probably today. We are looking at updating that study. But again, I think that we can take from 2019 data and what we know about today, that the issue is just as severe and probably more so. So again, just to underscore, you know, there are about 17,000 renters that were making below 50,000 in 2019. And of those, approximately half were not being served by the available units in the county. So there's a big need, and next slide, please. There's a big need, and we continue to look at ways to create new affordable rental units and bring in subsidies and land use policies where we can to create those opportunities. And then under homeownership, I think, you know, Karen already touched, either Karen or Dan touched upon how the median sales price has continued to go up. And that's, you know, been the same since 2010 in our county. And that's an issue. You know, it's hard for our people who are making 80% to buy a home. Mr. Spencer mentioned this, you know, if you're not already in your home, it's really hard to go out there. It's hard for any middle income family. And if you're low income, you know, it's really hard. A family that is making 80% of area median income, at the time the study was done, they could afford a home that was priced about $320,000. And so what we did is we looked at all the housing stock that sold for $320,000 and below. And we looked at some of the structure grade data that's available and analyzed that. And about 89% of all those units that were affordable to someone making 80% were rated as a 3 or less on the scale of 1 to 9. So the structure grade data rates properties and says, okay, on a scale of 1 to 9, what are the structural deficiencies and how does this home rate? So 89%, almost 90% of the units that were affordable to people making moderate incomes had major problems with it. And, you know, those are, of course, more concentrated in some of the older areas of the county, but that's where the affordable units are that people can buy. So that's just an important thing to keep in mind as we think about strategies to help people at the lower end of the income spectrum. Next slide, please. This is just a picture I wanted to show you of some of our rental housing that our loans have helped produce. This is a new, actually this one, the one on the left is a rendering. It hasn't been built yet, but we just closed on a loan, affordable financing for this. It's a 38 unit project in Jessup. And so it's a nice kind of a townhome designed rental property that's going to serve families making 60% of area median income and below. And the one on the right is Newtown 20, which was just completed in your district, in your area, and in the city of Annapolis, which was a redevelopment of a former public housing community. And now it's actually called Wilborn Place. So it's got a new name and amazing new residential units and then a great community center. Next slide, please. I've shared these with you because, I think it's important to see, when people think of affordable housing, and I'm doing air quotes, when they think of subsidized housing, they think of, dilapidated, big, high-rise communities that aren't in good shape. And we really do try to make an effort with our development partners to ensure that these are really high quality units that create, wonderful interior units as well as community amenities, and that they're outward facing, they blend in with the community. Marley Meadows on the left is a community up in the Pasadena, Glen Burnie area. And then the one on the right is affordable senior housing, Parkview at Edgewater, or I'm sorry, it's Victoria Park, which is located in Edgewater, and that's serving older adults age 62 and older. Next slide, please. And then just some tools that we're working with on the homeownership side, but we need to come up with some additional innovative strategies to really help produce the supply that Karen was talking about, because focusing on the demand side is not giving us luck in this market. We provide free first-time home buyer counseling, and that's regardless of income. If you know anybody who could use some help navigating the home buying process, wants to get their credit and their budget in good shape, come and see us. We have down payment closing costs and mortgage write-down assistance. That is limited to moderate and low-income home buyers, but it's a great deal because we provide, basically, it's a loan, but it's a 0% deferred loan. So it acts as a grant to really help people buy their first home. But it's been really challenging. We haven't had anyone utilize that program in the last year because of the market. And so when I came in, I am looking at, how can we retool this program to maybe increase the subsidy amount to keep up with these high home increases, and not only the house price increases, but now the mortgage rate increases that our first-time home buyers and every buyer is having to contend with. And finally, we do foreclosure prevention counseling. We don't want to see people get there, but sometimes people get in over their head. This free foreclosure prevention counseling is available to anybody, again, regardless of income. And we have a partnership where we're partnering with the state of Maryland to get people connected with financial resources there related to COVID if they need that. Next slide. And then just a couple other real quick strategies. We have some homeowner rehabilitation. Again, like I said, a lot of the units that are affordable or people are already living in them and they're affordable, they have major structural issues. So we provide, again, 0 interest deferred payment loans to do owner occupied property rehab. That's the before on the left and the after on the right. I probably shouldn't need to say that. Hopefully it's obvious. And then the next slide just shows we can also, sometimes we act to go and acquire properties ourselves, especially in some of our targeted communities. This one is in Brooklyn Park, and we acquire it and then we rehab it. And we've been renting them out to income eligible tenants, but looking at this as a model to maybe get some first-time home buyers into these units. That's an option that we're exploring again. And then finally, if you turn the next slide, just some solutions to kind of tag on to Karen. Again, I'm more focused on the low and moderate income spaces, but there are a lot of commonalities. For the low and moderate income, again, there's a need to subsidize them with county general funds, our federal home and CDBG. Again, all those have income restrictions. Payment in lieu of taxes. We did just get more than several properties in the county council meeting last week, got approved for an operating subsidy essentially, which is a discount on their property taxes to make them more affordable. And then also looking at reductions in local fees, especially for houses serving low income populations. And then leveraging county surplus property. Again, land, that's a huge issue, and finding land that can make a deal affordable is very challenging. And I'm not going to go into all this. I think Karen kind of covered it, but I do want to point out we have a great workforce housing provision in the code now, and we have our first workforce housing project coming in, and that it was a creative way. It's not the panacea, it's not the answer, but it's one great tool in the toolbox that the county's recently added, where we can have a development go into a commercial zone or an industrial zone or in an R5 or R10 and build up to R22, either rental or home ownership units, as long as they include a certain proportion as being workforce housing units. And then also provide some discounts for the water sewer connection fees. So we're seeing some success there. And then there are other things like that. Similarly, the housing for elderly and modest means zoning provision allows residential development in commercial districts where it's serving people who are older and low income. And then also just, I think, Karen and her colleagues on the market rate side, they butt up against this, and I'm hearing it constantly from our affordable housing developers. It's really hard to make projects work with adequate public facilities requirements that are currently in place. So I will leave it there and turn it over, I think, to Steve is following me.
Wonderful. Thank you. Patrick, are you able to put my presentation up?
Yeah, give me 1 second to do that.
And while he's doing it, I want to thank the 3 previous presenters, because I think there's so much of what they individually included that kind of gets wrapped up into what I'm going to talk about. So it's really helpful. I'd also ask, I know we're behind schedule, if we can hold questions till I get through mine, because parts of my slides and the information I'm going to show is going to generate a ton of questions. And so just to, in the interest of keeping us as on schedule as we can get, if we can hold off questions till the end of mine, if that's possible. So we're going to talk about relationships between adequate public facilities for schools and development and data. So next slide, Patrick. Okay. So we're going to talk about adequate public facilities. We're going to talk about school district feeder systems, and then the data that is used to support that. So first part, adequate public facilities, we call it APF. And so in all of our slides at the top, you will see a code citation, so that if you're interested afterwards in going and finding what the real language, code language says, it's as there as we can present it, because in a 10-15 minute presentation, I'm kind of skimming what I think is the most important components. So what APF is, it's the provision of adequate provisions for fire, roads, schools, sewer, and water facilities. That's what it's a series of regulations that each development application is tested against a standard that exists in code, and it determines whether they can move forward or they have to redesign projects so the project isn't feasible. So the county has responsibility to fund, construct APF in a timely, coordinated manner, as accomplished through the Capital Improvement Program, what we call the CIP, and guided by the General Development Plan, which was just overhauled comprehensively in May of 2021. It deals with the pace and distribution of development. It directs growth where adequate public infrastructure exists or will exist, consistent with the GDP, Water and Sewer Plan, and Article 18, which is zoning and development, resulting in a more predictable residential commercial development. And it also includes a component that I already talked about, which is APF testing, meaning certain developments must pass appropriate tests prior to approval of a development application. So next slide. And I want to stress, when we say development, we do not mean building permits. We mean residential subdivision or non-residential development. Okay. So Article 17, Subtitle 5 is the component of our code that deals with APF. And it's basically organized around a series of standards, how to pass test for adequate school facilities. And that's what I'm concentrating today in my presentation, schools, but because it affects the housing component that your three previous speakers discussed. What my Office of Planning and Zoning does is report the number and dwelling unit types to the Board of Ed. They take that, they run a mathematical formula, and they basically produce, in conjunction with us, which is what's called the utilization chart. That shows all the vacant seats in the public school system, how many forecast students are in those seats, and it also provides maps and information as to which schools are open for residential subdivision and which ones are closed. So that chart's approved by the council. It's revised annually. It's updated May 1 and September 1. It is based on projected enrollment, not actual enrollment. And that's become a controversial issue. You heard Karen talk about this. The issue is we can now go back and look at how the Board of Ed forecast growth 2 to 3 years out and marry that up with an actual that was 2 to 3 years out. And that's going to be a research assignment for us. It also shows open and closed capacities for elementary, middle, and high schools. It includes a component, what we call the wait list. And basically what that is a developer can still submit their project and get through a part of the process if the feeder system is closed and they go on a wait list. The wait list is usually consistent with the time period of the county's CIP in Anne Arundel County, that's 6 years, meaning you could propose development in a closed feeder system. You'll go through the process. It can't be realized if the school feeder system is closed, but you go onto this wait list, and after 6 years, if it's still closed, you can proceed with development. And the premise of that is that the county had 6 years to plan for that development to happen. And if it doesn't do it, won't do it, the developer is free to proceed. We culminate this in an annual report, which talks about the number, type of dwelling units approved, number, type of dwelling units on the wait list. It's sent to the Board of Ed, County Executive Planning Advisory Board. It's a complicated regulatory process. So next slide, Patrick. So one of the things I want to talk about, what type of projects are not subject to APF, which projects are exempt or when testing is not required. Non-residential developments, housing for the elderly of moderate means, age-restricted, meaning 55 years and older, residential subdivisions, agriculture preservation subdivisions, and dwelling units as an accessory use in commercial districts. Additionally, for no more than 5 lots, single-family detached dwellings, or no more than 5 dwelling units, if a property owner owned the property for a minimum of 3 years, both require agreement in the county, you are also exempt. These are typically very small subdivisions, what we call minors, 5 lots or less. And this does not impact the school APF or school utilization much at all. In section 17.5207, certain conditions must be met for residential development to qualify as exempt. Those typically exist in Parole Town Center. We've talked about that a great deal. Odenton Growth Management Areas, Mead Village, Glen Burnie Sustainable Community Overlay, or transit-oriented overlay development policy areas identified in the GDP. And other ones can occur as a part of, if they're funded in part by low-income tax credits. Next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Board of Ed's feeder systems. I hope everyone is somewhat familiar with the concept. Basically, you have a high school, and then you have 1 or 2 middle schools, and you have between 3 and 6 elementary schools. The elementary schools feed into the middle schools feed into the high school. That creates a feeder system. The map on the right shows all of the feeder systems in the county. Every one of those different colored areas will have at least 1 high school and at least 1 middle school. So that shows you geographically where the existing feeder systems are. If you built a new high school, you would have to create a new feeder system, and that would, in theory, affect many other feeder systems. The map on the left is all of those feeder systems, and as it stands today, and I'll talk more about this at the end of my presentation, the areas in red are what? Anybody want to take a guess? Closed, meaning Those areas you cannot typically do residential subdivision activity. The areas in blue are open for residential subdivision activity. And that's because in those red areas, the high schools or middle schools are over capacity. We're going to talk about capacity a whole lot towards the end. So next slide. So we are embarked on what I would call a public school APF work group that deals with just the school side. It's a work group that I lead that's been in effect. We have some members on this presentation or in the meeting that are very aware of this process. We've been underway for about 20 months. We are at the point where we've presented different policy objectives to the work group, and we're expecting that work group to make a recommendation in August. My anticipation is that we're going to have a recommendation to pretty much radically overhaul how we do school APF. That's what I would guess. I don't know. Karen, are you in agreement that that's a good guess?
Sorry, had to unmute. Yes, I absolutely. I think so much good work has been done. The data's out there, and
yeah,
I think changes are on the horizon.
Changes are on the horizon. So let's talk about some of that data. So one of the things is everybody knows that school overcrowding is caused by new residential permit activity, right? I mean, that's what's causing all of the school capacity issues. It's new building permits. Unfortunately, fortunately, that just isn't true. Permits for new construction are a very small part of the APF picture. Existing residential home sales outweigh permits issued for new construction over the last 20 years by a significant amount. This is a scary factoid for most people because everybody thought they knew the truth. So next slide. So I want you to spend a little bit of time perusing this slide. This is countywide residential building permits and existing home sales. We separate out the two. A new building permit is a standalone thing that someone will buy a house or buy land that a building permit will be issued. And then we also show in the lighter blue the number of existing home sales not related to new building permits. And as you look at the trends over the last 20 years, when you go back to 2001, we issued 3,200 new building permits, and not related to those, we had 4,250 existing home sales. The ratio was pretty even. As you move up into the last 5-8 years, now we have for 2020, as an example, we issued just under 2,000 building permits, and we had 12,855 existing home sales not related to those building permits. We're working with ratios of 6 to 7 to 1 over the last 7 to 10 years in the number of home sales versus new building permits. And I would ask the question, we had a little bit of a debate yesterday that I think we can work through and figure out, is there much difference between an existing home sale in terms of the number of students it generates versus a new building permit? We think it's minimal. They're very similar. I think there are some who think existing home sales produce more public school students. That's something we'll want to analyze. But the bottom line is only, all the kids coming into the public school system, 85% of those are coming in from existing home sales, not new residential development. And guess what? We don't test existing home sales for APF. We test new development. We're over-regulating a component of the development industry and ignoring another component, which is home sales. And it by far impacts student generation far more than new building permits. Next slide. So this is another, I think, fascinating slide. There's a ton of data on this, but basically we went back and looked at, we have the data. The data is produced by the Board of Ed through an annual Board of Ed Public Facilities master plan, where they have an enormous amount of data they capture on an annual basis. So we can compare and contrast that data versus what we know about school facilities. So what this chart is showing starts at 2002, And we had 71,264 students sitting in 82,781 seats. In 2002, we had 11,500 vacant seats in the public school system. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not an individual school that is overcrowded. And when I showed you the charts about the areas of the county that are closed, the reason they're closed is a high school might be 5 students above capacity, or a middle school very similar, and we don't redistrict to balance enrollment with the adjoining feeder systems. So when you look back on 2002 and you look at the far columns on the right, the difference between student enrollment, and that's actual enrollment, that's not forecast. We are averaging an enormous, we have a glut of vacant seats in the public school system, and we have had for 20 years. And I'll get to that in a minute. So on average, over 11,000 vacant seats exist on an annual basis over 20 years. Comparing total enrollment and state rated capacity from 2002 to 21, we've had 11,243 vacant seats in the public system on an annual basis. Not one time where we had to build a bunch of schools. Every year that we're averaging that. Now, data on this slide is from the 2022 Educational Master Facility Plan, which is produced by the Board of Ed. I want to go to the right side of the slate here. So changes in state rated capacity between 2002 and 21, we increased state rated capacity by 13,403 seats. What that means is we built that many seats in 20 years. Student enrollment change between the same time period was only 8,423. Average student enrollment from 2002 to 2021 is 75,365. Average state rated capacity from 2002 to 2021 is 86,611. Average available seats from 2002 to 2010 is 9,367. Average number of available seats from 2011 to 2020 is now up to 12,405. This was a bad trend in 2002. We've made it worse. So if you look at the chart and you go to the year 2003, state rated capacity, this is how many the state says, how many seats the state says we have. That number is 83,455. Go to the 2021, go back a year in 2020. 2021 for enrollment is a wonky number because of COVID. We lost some students and we don't know if they're coming back. But just go to 2020. It's 83,044. Bottom line is we had enough seats in the public school system in 2003 to accommodate today's student yield. I don't know about you, but that's a scary factoid. We continue to carry 10, 12,000 vacant seats. We continue to build seats. We have a new school coming. The good thing is we have the Board of Ed is embarked because there's a new high school on basically what will be a countywide redistricting effort. And where I want to end up with this part of my discussion is that the reason we have these gaps, which we kind of call gross gaps because they make no sense. We have spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, probably over $1 billion, building seats that no one is sitting in today, or perhaps will ever sit in. And what could we have been using that money towards? Affordable housing, workforce housing, offsetting workforce housing in terms of impact fees or water and sewer. And this is something that the county is only becoming, I'm going to say, aware of in the last year and a half. And maybe some in the development community knew it, but I think what has occurred from this process that we've embarked on is that we have so much better understanding of the data. I'm going to say the unwillingness or inability to redistrict means that large portions of the county will remain closed to residential development, which means we can't do workforce and affordable housing in those areas unless there's significant code changes. So I want to follow up. Last slide, and then I'll talk about some of the questions real quick as best I can. So some of our findings, real estate, stock composition, and this was a part of what we were talking about. Housing stock consists mainly of single-family detached homes. In 2020, most residential properties were single-family detached, over 60%. Single-family attached homes made up 20%, and multifamily dwellings made up 17% of total housing units in that 20 years. Percentages in that 20 years are generally consistent. All feeder districts considered, except Meade, contain similar unit distributions. So each of the feeder systems, we're not talking about region plan geography areas, they have similar components of single family, multifamily, and other types of housing units. The real estate issue of own versus rent. A majority of residential property is owner occupied. Rental units represented 24% of total housing units in 2020. That's a relatively small percentage. A number that has been consistent for the last 20 years, give or take less than half of 1% on an annual basis. Student enrollment and utilization. Multiple feeder systems remain closed to new development. Between 2003 and 2020, 3 feeder districts were closed to new development 70% of the time. And most 7 feeder districts were closed at least 50% of this duration. Chesapeake High School is the only feeder district to remain open. And what I understand is while there was a school that was planned and then was built, which was Chesapeake, community members were so outraged with the thought of new residential development, this is quite a while ago, that they convinced the then county government to purchase those developable pieces of land and made them parks. So we have a school that sits in an area surrounded kind of by parkland that you would have to bus students a very long way to get there. But it is terribly underutilized. It's one of those examples that contributes to the 12,000 vacant seats, but it doesn't encompass anywhere near a majority. It's probably 1,000 of those students. South River High School was closed 15 of 18 years. Now think about this. It was closed for a new residential subdivision with a steady enrollment increase and less than 50 permits for new residential development issued each year. It's closed for 15 of 18 years, but there was no residential development occurring. Student enrollment real estate outliers. We talked about this. Chesapeake High School has experienced steady decline in enrollment from 2001 to 2020. During this time frame, Chesapeake experienced the same trends in construction permits, which were decreasing, and existing home sales, which were increasing, consistent with the rest of the county. So we're just sharing some findings of the results of our analysis. But at the end of the day, in order for us to really take a hard look, if we're going to increase the housing stock and have a focus on workforce and affordable housing, we have to deal with this school APF issue. Hopefully we're positioned now with our work group to make some pretty far-reaching recommendations that will come from the administration and to the council. It'll probably be a new council who gets the recommendations, but we are cautiously optimistic that we have an opportunity to change things. And then I want to really quickly get back to just a couple of the questions that came out. The build out issue, the problem we have is that when we do our analysis of build out, it's based on vacant land, what we think can be developed on that land, historic trends. What it doesn't do is take into account the broader regional need for more housing. That is an area that I think we do need to work on, because our build out scenario will not let us reach what the region says we need to accommodate in new housing. On the density issues, one of the things you probably don't know is that we have provisions in the town center under what's called an incentive program or a bonus. They're complicated, but we have in 3 occasions in parole and 1 occasion, well, actually 2 in Odenton. We have suggested to the developer while they're planning their projects, and they're coming in and they're basically getting what the code by right allows them to do. We are suggesting to them that we would consider through an incentive program much higher densities. taking a 5-story building to a 10 or 12-story, for example, in parole, which would allow for significant increases in density in those areas. Unfortunately, in parole, what we've been told by the development community is the cost to, build the concrete pedestal and then go up is so extreme at the present time that they love the gift of more residential density and accept that some of it would be workforce and affordable, but they can't afford to build it. That's what we've been told in 3 occasions. And it's kind of interesting, was like, why aren't we doing higher densities in parole? It's because the developers there say they can't afford to do it. We have 2 cases in Odenton. One looks more promising. It is not a massive increase in density, but it is somewhat, and we're negotiating kind of how much of that would be workforce or affordable. I want to talk a little bit about some of the issues, whether it's regulations and how you apply them to land. For some of the workforce or affordable housing projects, the developers of those projects tend to look at land that might be distressed, meaning it has problems. It has a lot of environmental features. There are weird easements on it, and difficult to develop without a very large number of modifications. And a modification is basically a variance that the person in my position can grant under certain criteria. And so it does make it hard to shoehorn in an affordable housing project when they want to disturb a half an acre of non-tidal wetlands. There are 5 specimen trees. It's in a floodplain. Our view is we've got to find better developable land for these projects, because the other part we've had is some of the developers say, listen, we want to do this great thing for the county, but I need 5 environmental modifications, and I don't want to provide the required landscape buffers. I don't want to provide the required open space or active open space. And I mean, I've had situations where I had a developer in the last 3 months propose for their open space, parking lot landscaping islands, a dumpster pad location, and the lobby of the building. And they would need multiple mods to do that, and that was not something that I could agree to do. So part of this is, I think, collectively, all of us finding land. And when I say land, and this will get to my last comments, we've, land that can be developed according to reasonable regs. I'm not unwilling to make modifications to help them, but what we're seeing is kind of over the top. So we got to have land that's actually developable. And in order to do that, the role you play as the SAC is hugely important. At the end of the day, you're going to be making recommendations in this plan that will go to the county council on land use changes that may not have been contemplated in the GDP. You're also going to be making recommendations on comprehensive rezoning in your region plan area. And you're also going to be making recommendations on changes to the regulatory system. I can't tell you if you'll be successful. If we're all working together and you have a cogent plan, it makes it so much easier to convince the council to adopt a plan that has the things that you need for your community. So I know I took a lot of time with that. So I'm going to close and turn it back over to Patrick.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks for
Yeah,
everything.
Go ahead, Leo.
I was just going to say, okay, thanks for the presentation. It was really very helpful and enlightening. And you can see some of the disconnects between some of the rules that we're asked to follow and what's really happening. So it's interesting to see. Patrick, I'll turn it back over to you.
I didn't have any further comments. I think that this has been a really very meaty discussion. There's an awful lot to consider here. Thanks to the information shared by all of our presenters today. I know that you all put a lot of effort into preparing these presentations, the data, and giving us a lot to think about. We had, I believe that I had already emailed everybody about this, putting a tentative date for August the 11th as a time when we could continue this conversation about housing and some of the housing needs in our region. So I think with if you agree, Leo and Anna and the rest of you, I think it would be a good idea to let's firm that time up, and maybe we can all reconvene at the same time on August the 11th and
Yeah, that's right.
continue this
August
conversation.
9th, Patrick. I think it's August 9th,
Is it
right?
August? It's Tuesday. That's August 9th.
Yep.
Thank
Patrick,
you
will
for
any
the
of the speakers
correction.
be available to come back and answer questions?
We hadn't anticipated having them come back a second time, but I would say if there are any questions, any specific questions that you all have for them, we have a few minutes now that we may be able to cover some of them. Otherwise, you can certainly email any questions to me or to Desiree, and we can share them with the speakers and get some responses for you.
Patrick,
Yes.
this is Tony Spencer. No questions, just comments. And I just want to share, I served on the school board from 99 in Anne Arundel to 2004. In capacities on the state level, private level of education with the Maryland Association of Boards of Education, and mayor's office and things like that. The leaders in the county council on the state level and also in the city will have some major decisions to make. Some of these decisions, this gentleman just gave an excellent presentation of where we are and where we've come from. But one thing that's not there, and he can't put in his report because it's in society's heart, is the school system we're getting too brown. And that's why, here's a very good example. West Annapolis Elementary was 119% at capacity, over capacity, where less than a mile away, Germantown Elementary was less than half full. A lot of those people are leaving the school system because the kids, I won't say a lot, enough, because the schools are getting too brown with Hispanic and Black folk. So it's something else that we can make recommendations, but our leaders are going to have to make major decisions beyond their political preferences of what is really right for the community. That right now has driven a lot of decisions why people are where they are, while boundaries have always been where they are. Parole, Germantown, Eastport, those names, when you hear those names, the Fourth Ward, it tells you, it told people years ago how far you could go. And so in the city, that same thing is just still in our culture. So it's more than just what's defined on paper in these studies. These studies are excellent. The presenters today, they tore it up. But things, some of the recommendations, I hope this gets in the minutes. We're gonna have to make recommendations to the county council, to the school board, how the state school board can influence this, and even federal monies that come down. People have been building and allowed to do things and keep people out. And Crofton is a perfect example, overpopulated for many years. Some of the kids going to South River, some going to Arundel High. But a lot of it also was based on race and not wanting my kids around your kids. So if we are not wise enough in this time frame to use it, to include it in our decision making, then we're really missing a golden opportunity of telling the truth. Thank you. I'm finished.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate the comment. And it is a lot more to think about. Who else has a question for Kai? I'm looking to see if I see hands up here. Tony's was up. And anyone else have questions for Kai or any of our other presenters right now? So Lily, I see your hands up. Why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. Yes, I agree. Those were excellent presentations, and everybody knows I love to hear the data. So I was very happy about all the data presentations. I just threw out, because I think it's a good example, the Crownsville property that is going to be transferred to the county. When those large land transfers are done, does the planning department go in and look at opportunities for affordable housing to go into those areas?
Hi, Lily. This is Steve Kai-Ziegler. No, that's really not a function for the planning department to do. And I'll just give you an example. We might be involved in certain properties for different reasons. The Crownsville station, we were very involved in the county acquiring that from a cultural resource standpoint, historic preservation. I will say that we don't go out. Do you mean, are we trying to identify properties that could be used for affordable housing as opposed to reacting when a developer comes to us? I guess we're probably not as proactive as
Yeah, I think
You're quite-
I'm looking at ways that we could, as communities or as the government working with the communities, be more proactive, because when there aren't that many parcels that become available, and when something of that size does, it seems, the
Yeah.
presentation of the smaller homes in some kind of groupings with open space, that would seem at Crownsville to be, there'd be potential to do things like that. And I just, when it starts getting developed and it goes off into another track, who's looking at those type of issues?
What I would say, just real quick on that, is that this group and the other 8 region planning, SACs, you're going to be evaluating properties in your region for different potential uses, and as will we as a planning staff. I mean, Cindy can confirm that. So, now that we have a brand new GDP and we have 9 region areas to plan for, and we will have 9 SACs to assist us, this is the type of planning process that we need in order to address the question you just asked. Otherwise, we were working with a GDP that dated back to 2009 and small area plans that were roughly 20, 25 years old. So we're laying the groundwork to be able to do exactly what you're asking us to do.
Right. So Lily, I'm going to talk a little bit to that too. I was involved in a couple of presentations to Crownsville homeowners groups, and I can tell you they're not excited about increased density, increased traffic, issues with Crownsville Road. Anyone who travels there knows it's a kind of a sidecar to get in and out of Annapolis when 97 is a mess. And so they face, in their opinion, and probably rightfully so, some of the same pressures that people on the peninsula do, where there's limited traffic path in and out of there. So whole scale or large development, or even numbers that really start to get to critical mass in terms of economics, it's not an easy sell over there.
It's not an easy sell in much of the county.
Yeah,
and I'm not saying it would be, but it doesn't, and there's significant investment in infrastructure that would be required, but it's not a peninsula, and it could infrastructure wise be redesigned. And how many parcels of that size does the county get to acquire? It just seems that there's a lot of great ideas about affordable housing, and I'm going to research some of the developments, but there are stories out there about large developments that were supposed to become affordable housing units and did not end up that way. So where's the disconnect when those properties become, kind of go off the path of affordable housing? And it just seems one suggestion was using, acquiring county properties. And so that's really why I'm talking about that as a large county property that was just acquired.
Right. Well, we're gonna have to move on. I want to hit 2 more people who have their hands up, and then we're going to call for an adjournment today. Jonathan, you had you wanted to make a point?
Yeah, I thought Kai's presentation was incredible, truly incredible from the development side. I was just wondering, how is that going to be communicated to the development community? I just know from a lot of people that I know and I work with have no idea that this is coming. And a lot of people just shied away from Anne Arundel County in general, because, especially in the Annapolis area and around here, because of the feeder systems are closed, right? And the adequate facility legislation, people just don't play here anymore. So how will this be communicated?
Well, I would say, Steve Ziegler here, I would say it is being communicated in every venue I can find. Our school APF work group, we have about, I'm going to guess, 20 people in the work group, but it's not uncommon for us to have 60 other people, 40 to 60 people listening in. We make all of the data available. I spend a fair amount of time talking with individual council members. The administration knows what we're finding. Everybody knows it's very controversial, and it will be very, very political in how this is addressed. But I would ask, I don't know, you know, we have one of the more prominent developers in the county, Karen McJunkin. I don't know, how do you think it's going over and being represented?
Well, I think the minute that we turn to the data, and that's exactly what you saw today, you know, it's quite a cross section on the task force. And I think the heads are nodding. The data speaks for itself, and we're not talking in metaphors or stories or, you know, specific examples of one kid in one school. We're talking about overall data at this point. And Jonathan, I firmly agree with you that part of this is getting the data out and the message out to the county residents, and you can draw your own conclusions, but getting the data out there so folks understand that, okay, maybe the county has not put its capital improvement resources in the right area in terms of new school construction, and maybe that's not the answer in the future. But to date, that data hasn't been out there. And I think Steve and his group is doing a good job continuing with that. I think to the extent that the council people can jump on board and you know, not taking a position, but just getting the data out to their constituents would be helpful as well.
So let me add one more thing, is that this is real data that comes, a lot of it, not all of it, comes from the Board of Education. We've kind of built a culture of not redistricting, right? We know that. And so we've built a culture of building seats that aren't needed. We've built a culture of, you know, some really poor practices. But I would say that the Board of Ed, the teachers, and all the parents who have kids in the public school system are terrified of the information we're sharing, because it's a paradigm shift if we actually do something with it. So they're not you know, we have good friends in the staff who work for the Board of Ed. We're all professionals, but what I can't say that they're looking at this information the same way we might be, which is, let's change everything. Because for them, that means a massive countywide redistricting, and the Board of Ed is now elected. So when elected officials contemplate something that is terrifying to their constituents, what do they often do? They listen to their constituents. So there's a lot with this. I mean, I tend to think a countywide comprehensive redistricting is the most controversial thing that can happen in county government. There is nothing more controversial than that. But we have the data on our side. I think it's coming. It's just a matter of time.
Right. So let's move on for one more question we have time for. It's from Larry. You want to go ahead?
Yeah, again, I just like to echo everybody else. Thank you to all the presenters. I thought the information was extremely insightful and valuable. Quick question, I know we're up against time, so maybe there'll be a written component back to this, but for Steve Kai, what recommendations, or actually for any of the presenters, what recommendations or suggestions you have for us in terms of the kind of tools and things that we should be thinking about in terms of improving zoning and land use to be able to achieve some of the affordable housing goals in our Region 7?
So just speaking for planning and zoning, this group, we need to find better properties to do affordable and workforce housing than the ones that are being presented to us. They are distressed properties. There's a reason that they've fallen in the lap of workforce and or affordable, and that's because other development interests have tried to make projects work on those sites and couldn't because of the same issues any other use would have. That's one. I think, you know, when you get into the part where you're making recommendations on the land use designation and the zoning of individual pieces of property, take into account these discussions that we're having. We are going to have to rezone land in order to accomplish these public policy objectives. And the last one I'll say is, in my mind, school adequate public facilities is the single largest impediment. It's way more important than all the other things in being able to do workforce or affordable housing wherever we want to do it in the county, because you can't do it now because the schools in theory are closed in those areas. They're really not closed, but they're closed.
Right. So again, it's a real eye opener to hear this information. You know, some of us are familiar with, and others, I'm sure it's new. Really, really great stuff. We're actually at 12 o'clock now. So what I'd like to do, Patrick and I have been communicating in Desiree, and we're going to go ahead and add a meeting. And I think it was the 9th. Is that right, Desiree? Yeah.
Yes, the
Okay.
9th.
So we'll go with the 9th, and we'll put that on the calendar and get an invite out. And I'm going to encourage everyone on the panel or in our group to go ahead and email questions to Patrick, Desiree, or myself, or formulate your list, and we'll try and speak to those or get answers to those from our presenters today. And we may have to communicate with them again and have them provide some responses to the group. It's a really important topic and kind of a real driver for all of us. So thank you all for doing such a nice job with the presentations, and we'll be working hard to see if we can come up with some suggestions for the county to consider as solutions. With that, I'm going to go ahead and Patrick, did you have anything else you wanted to hit before we go, or Desiree?
That was it. I think we've
Okay,
got everything.
great.
Thank you.
Thanks again for you guys sticking with us. I'm sorry we missed our break today. And but let's go ahead and I'm going to call for a move to adjourn the meeting.
So moved, Tony.
Second.
Second, Larry.
Great. So thank you all again. Thanks to our presenters, and I'll look forward to talking with all of you at our next meeting. So thanks, and we're going to be adjourned for that.
Great presentations, buddy.
Thanks all.
Thank you to all the presenters. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.